last time you and I were talking about, I think it was the 12th of the principles that were laid out in the PMBOK version 7. And I thought we had left it at the end of last week that we would continue on with change management versus change control, only this time put more emphasis on the change management side. Is that correct?
That is totally correct. We had a good time talking about tickets and change requests and that kind of thing. Now we can get into change itself. I thought that would be exciting.
Well, having lived the life of a project manager for most of my 40-year career, if not from a team lead, then certainly through managing large projects, change is inevitable. I think last time we even referred to the fact that the only constant on a project is change.
Yes.
which is kind of oxymoronic. As we prepared for today, I was thinking about a situation. We were involved in a very large project, my team and I, overseeing it on behalf of a Western state, where they were putting in a Medicaid system, and right in the middle of all of that, Congress passed new legislation, which, for those of you who are not in our American audience, it's affectionately known as Obamacare. What's interesting here is that, last time we talked about change control. Obviously, with new legislation, we had to do a lot of change control, meaning we had to look at what we had already done, and we were well on the way in design and development of the system. We had to look at what already had to be done and get backed out and therefore redone with the new legislative rules, but also, and this is where I think we want to go today with change management, the entire culture of the organization changed, as well as the people who were receiving the benefits of the programs. Their culture essentially changed because suddenly with the rule changes, everyone had to scramble and figure out what it really meant and how to get their medical insurance and that sort of thing. So I think that was probably the best example I can think of from my own experience, where not only was change control very significant, but change management was equally as significant, if not more.
We're looking at a bunch of things that have happened in the last 5 years that are driving monumental change. We look at COVID, we look at the whole idea of this unique new vaccine that had to roll out quickly, and all of a sudden there are modifications to it on a yearly basis. And then because of COVID and because of lockdown, we have supply chain problems and all these things. And so I believe, and this is reflected in a lot of my students, that we're facing a culture and a climate of change like we never have before.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's something that you just don't code for. It's used to be able to say, well, change happens because we coded for it. Well, now coding is sort of an afterthought because of the monumental changes that are affecting our society, our culture, our businesses, our organizations, our nonprofits, everything.
This is just part of the nature of life, and you have to expect it, not necessarily to change that change, but be able to respond to it in an effective manner so that it doesn't get in the way of your plans.
So I'm thinking, Tim, before we go much further, maybe we just spend a couple of minutes on refreshing our audience with what we believe is the difference between change control and change management. What do you think that'll help our discussion today?
That would be perfect. That would be perfect. So let's define those. What do you consider change control?
Well, let me go back to my programming days and my on-the-floor management days. To me, change control is really, it's kind of like the nuts and bolts of handling changes that occur to the system per se, to the project. It sort of deals with when I said nuts and bolts, to me, it deals with process. So that would be the submission of the change request. That would be the assessing of the impact. That would be obtaining approvals to go forward with the change. Implementing that change to the program, the project, or the system as seamlessly as possible. So for me, It's really the nuts and bolts of something that is occurring with the system.
Yeah, to give a really informal and not truly accurate answer, basically it's the ticket management system for
Yeah.
changes that are coming through and the evaluation of those tickets. It's saying, is this necessary? Is this really not necessary? Or is this something we want to put on the shelf and consider in a few days or weeks?
Well, and the projects that I've been involved in over the years where we handled change, and of course, every project handles change. But one of the purposes that we used in coming up with a change control process is to make sure that change was introduced in a very methodical way, such that we could minimize the risk, such that we could maintain the ongoing integrity of the system or the project, such that we could keep the momentum going as much as possible, which was not possible given the first anecdote that I used, because when you have something as consequential as new legislation that really upends what you've been doing, then the momentum does in fact get lost. But nonetheless, I think from that perspective, the purpose is definitely to be able to maintain that momentum and make sure that the initial objectives are met.
When we're talking about change control, it's control of the project change on the behalf of the deliverable to improve its ability to meet objectives or to the plan.
So if we understand that what we just discussed kind of fit the definition of change control on any project, where would you say change management comes in differing from change control?
I've been trying to create my own definition. I don't want to take the definition out of PMBOK because it's so huge and lumbering and it's comprehensive, but it's almost, you have to take a few minutes to just think about it, much less talk about it. But change management is looking at the whole environment, not just the project. And you can think of change management as what an organization or an organization manager or a corporation or a CEO has to go through. It's making sure that the people, groups, and organizations are here today. They need to be there tomorrow. And what do we need to do from a functional and a behavioral standpoint to make that difference? That's basically what it is.
And so if I take by the way, I agree with that description. And so if I take that now at the project level, it seems to me that change control that we just described earlier would be just sort of a microcosm of an entire change management environment.
Yeah. And the thing is, we have to really think about this, because when it comes to change, projects are change. They're a specifically controlled change that helps a business. But on the other hand, there are things happening outside the corporation, inside the organization, and around the project that if they change in one way or another, the project is going to have to respond. So where change control evaluates the tickets and determines what the appropriate change is and makes that change happen, change management is looking at the big picture, because we have a lot of people involved. And when people go through change, they have certain reactions, and we have organizations involved, and they have to do their change control. And we have to tie all this together to make sure, that the organizations are stable as we go through this. The corporation is stable. And as a project manager, change management says, as this change occurs, we have to maintain the stability.
I've heard it also described as mindset.
Yeah.
Because truly, change control is more process driven. Change management, in my mind, is more human behavior driven. I think that just seems.
I'd love to say that with you.
In fact, a lot of projects I've been on, in order to distinguish it from change control so that people wouldn't get it mixed up in their minds, we often threw the word organizational in front of it. So it was
Yeah.
organizational change management, abbreviated to OCM.
Yeah, that's actually a good approach. But yeah, if it's not totally behavioral, there's a big portion of change management that truly is.
Well, in that opening gambit that I use of implementing Obamacare, when we did that, what the part of the change management was also cultural, because the subject matter experts that we relied upon from the customer side also had to learn the new rules and the new behavioral models that their own clientele might be involved in as a result of implementing that. So it was a change management effort, but we had to kind of figure it out as we went along. And so we ended up relying a lot on our federal partners to help explain a lot of the rules for us so that we could implement them and put them out there in the culture itself.
Yeah, let me give you another one in response to that. Data centers. A data center is a large facility or a part of a building that says we're going to create a stable environment for data and applications. Okay. Now, imagine this. I'm coming into a corporation and trying to help a corporation decide, do they need a data center now? And corporations will almost always say yes until they see the price of it. But then you start thinking about it and you start doing your surveys and interviews and inventories. And a corporation starts realizing every employee has a little box by their feet called a network attached storage. And that's where the stuff that makes the corporation go resides. And that network attached storage is not managed by IT. They sometimes can't see it. And these things are very flimsy. And let's add to that picture. All of a sudden, a corporation says, okay, this is not how we're going to feel secure as a corporation. We need to move all these data and applications into a very robust environment called a data center, and we're going to move it 50 miles away. How do you think employees are going to feel? No, that's my data.
Yeah.
That's me. I can't do that. And I only feel safe if it's right by my feet. And so change management says we understand you and we need to move to a new model. How are we going to do this together?
Yeah. So it becomes a culturalization of not just the people, but also of maybe even of the IT shop.
It's a 90-degree turn in the way business is run inside of a corporation. And it can often take 9 months to prepare for even the project to be promoted, much less started.
A lot of my colleagues like to use the word socialize as a verb. And they would say that they would socialize this among their constituents. So
yeah, and we use the word, since I was in marketing a lot, and I come from business anyway, we use the word education and awareness. So that's a polite way of saying socializing.
So when I talked earlier about change control being more process driven, that is the submission, the assessment, and all that, I would say that the activities involved in change management might include some things like communication, training, stakeholder engagement. You certainly can't go forward with change management without your stakeholders being engaged, and some sort of supportive nature of the organizational culture itself. So that's where I think there's a huge difference between the two. And as long as we understand that we're talking about managing change that's larger, then I think this conversation will take a different bent than what we had last week.
Oh, certainly. For instance, you used a very good structure for managing change, not just as individual change requests, but change as a big transition for not just function and process, but for people and their attitudes. Okay. Now, we've been studying this for a while. And in fact, if you go into the PMBOK in their models, they talk about different models of of change management. Have you explored that at all, or looked into that?
Personally, I have not, because we typically would develop our own. Although the last two organizations that I consulted with definitely have in terms of the change management process, have gone for what they call, I think it's called PROSCI,
Uh-huh.
ProSci certification, and they use something called ADCAR.
Yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
yeah, so
That's one of my favorite models.
so that's becoming sort of the standard. But when I was involved in these, we typically looked culturally with our organizational change management staff. They were a whole different team, as well as internally in terms of what it would take to change the system or the project itself. So we had kind of a dual approach to change management and built a lot of this ourselves. In fact, I probably mention this every podcast, that I was more involved in fixed price bids, whereby once you won the bid and were awarded the contract, you had to do it for a price certain and within a time certain. And so a lot of those situations required us to present in our proposal, before we were ever awarded the bid, what our change management model was.
Mhm.
And then once we're awarded, we would have to synchronize our change management model with potentially the one that the client had themselves, and make sure that both teams were on the same team, the same approach to make change management happen on the project.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Let's compare what you've just described to that ADCAR model.
Okay, yeah.
And see what it looks like. ADCAR is actually a structure built on an acronym for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And let's see what ADCAR looks at in a similar way, but also ignores if it needs to. Awareness, that's the first A. This is actually describing and communicating why change is necessary. It's basically, again, like I said, it's the education and awareness. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it.
And in the projects that I was involved, that I just described, where we would present our change management model in the proposal and then work with the customer, often the awareness came from our customer, because they knew what was going on in the organization and would bring any kind of need for change to the project team and saying, how do we handle this? So yeah, the awareness is almost built in, right, into their awareness.
Right.
So D you said was desire?
The next one is desire. Yeah. And once they know the change is necessary, there needs to be some type of function and some type set of activities that helps people become supportive of the change. It has to be a conscious action, just like you do with stakeholders. You have their current state and their future state, and you're trying to constantly move them to a supportive state.
Yeah, in the models that we presented, I like this comparison. In the models that we presented to our clients and then implemented on the project, that was very much part of the process. We would set up a frequent and consistent approach to managing anything that came across our client's desk, or even if we became aware of something, such that every single potential change was discussed. And if you talk about desire, you could not elbow one of our customers out of the room if you wanted to, because they were that much a part of what was going on and needed to make sure that the change was truly required and truly implementable.
Cool.
So that was the desire part. That was built in.
Let's talk about the K, which is knowledge. They need to understand how to change. And boy, I bet both you and I have something to say about that.
Well, that's a lot where we talked about last time about change control itself. And a lot of that came from our tools, our techniques, our templates, and just our entire process that we followed very religiously, very emphatically. And so the knowledge of the process not only was communicated from us to our clients or our customers, but our customers would communicate their knowledge of what was required to us so that we could implement it according to their priorities and according to what was needed.
There's a sense of transparency to this from a strategic standpoint too.
Definitely. Yes.
If you do not share the how and the why, people, number one, will feel disengaged, and number two, they'll feel irrelevant because you're not sharing me with information. Well, I guess I'm not that important, and I guess if I'm not important, I'm not going to participate. These are the things that we have to remember, that, you know, we're not dealing with computers. We're dealing with human beings here.
Well, and you said something real important too, because the why is sometimes left out. And we don't do change for change's sake. We do change because it's absolutely critical to the final product.
There has to be that purpose. It's funny. People will follow steps if you know, if that's what their responsibility is. But if they understand why, and if that why is highly personal, and this is a leadership trick, if that why is highly personal to them, they're going to be much more directly and much more deeply engaged.
Oh, huge. Yeah. So, okay. So we did A, D, and K. There's an A. What's the second A?
Ability.
Oh, ability.
Give
Okay,
them a chance to play with it. Give them prototypes. Give them a chance to provide feedback. Give them experience with it. Okay. It actually helps them embrace the change. That at this point, the change and the transition through the change is real, and they start feeling a potential for, hey, I can handle this.
Yeah, not only that, is we would also assist with the assessment. We would also be able to help our customers in this situation, or the end user organization, understand the practicality of certain aspects of change. And I've been in situations where the change seemed almost absolutely necessary until we explained the pros and cons. And the customer said, okay, we can live without that. So yeah, there's that ability, but there's also the ability not to.
Yeah. And even on the simplest, shortest projects, just having your stakeholders participate in gathering requirements and then going through some type of user acceptance testing creates that sense of, hey, okay, I see what this is about. And it can actually instill what you're looking at, that confidence that says, I know it's not that important. Or, yeah, that's really important. And sometimes the stakeholders at the beginning of the project can't tell you that.
I think you just described the R in ADKAR, which is the reinforcement aspect.
Well, it's interesting because reinforcement is actually looking at doing this over and over and over and over. Yeah. It's the practice that follows the demonstration of the functionality, where these things become habits. And this is the important thing. They wax poetic about ADKAR and the PMBOK, and they talk about, you know, this can include rewards, recognition, feedback, and measurement. And you can actually do this both from a functional standpoint and also from a behavioral standpoint. But fundamentally, it's going to be done.
Absolutely. But, you know, I was just thinking as you were talking about that last part, is this a good time maybe to spend a couple minutes on understanding change management in Agile versus predictive?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Because it really, this is something I've thought about through my last 2 months of classes. And I've tried to describe change in Agile, not from a tactical standpoint. We can talk about that, but from a strategic standpoint, how does change work in Agile, and how does Agile assist this idea of the vision of change for the organization? And that's where I want to look at.
Yeah, that my experience has been 90% predictive and only a small part Agile. But the part that I became very appreciative of in Agile was, let's say we had 3-4 week sprints where you actually delivered working components of the product. Now your customer is getting a vision of what's possible. And so we can tweak as we go along in the next sprint and the next sprint. We can tweak those ideals that we had when we first started the project and watch the product kind of emerge from our own creativity.
Right.
That's not possible nearly to that effect in a predictive model where you're doing analysis and design over potentially several months before you even see anything available for testing or coding.
So let's zoom out even a little further.
Yeah.
And let's look at agile projects compared to predictive. Predictive, you have a map and you know what you're going to do week 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, at least at some level, right?
Correct.
Agile, you say, we have a bunch of unknowns here, and we're going to have some very generally defined work. And what we're going to be doing is closing in on it to define it rather quickly. Now, the thing is, with a schedule and with a budget, with resources, you can create a cadence. You can create a certain type of timing. We're going to meet every time we've completed one of these activities, and the plan itself can actually drive this timing. But the problem is, if you have unknown work, you can't create that cadence. So the beautiful thing about Agile is saying, okay, we don't have a plan to create this regularity in our work. So let's do it with a bunch of Scrum ceremonies. And let's create this Agile framework that defines how the group works together. We follow this process and system, and it creates that comfort and safety.
And yet there is an overall plan. I mean,
yes,
it's a high-level plan, yes.
There's always a plan. And
so
go ahead.
No, I was thinking, when I really sat down and thought about this, because having been involved in both types of projects, I've actually had the situation in a predictive project where we delivered testable code to our end users who would be doing the user acceptance test. And I actually heard the phrase, "I know that's what we asked for, but that's not what we wanted." Now, this was after 1.5 years of analysis, design, development. Now we're into testing. The difference between what I witnessed on Agile was every time we did a new post-sprint ceremony to show the product, there was many aha moments as we moved along.
Yes.
I didn't get any aha moments, and that one was a very disappointing moment.
There's a gap, and in traditional projects, it can be a huge gap between the time that the data is collected from stakeholders, and we've started creating that and moving it into a physical reality. And so when that hits, you have to back out the work. Now, what Agile does is it shortens that cycle, and it puts these iterations, these review cycles, right in the middle of the work constantly. And it gets rid of that risk of not exposing the expectations until too late.
Well, and the other side of that coin, or the same side of that coin for Agile perhaps, is unless you have a very stringent set of requirements going in, if you have kind of that let's create it as we go along attitude, you end up with far fewer changes because everything is really a change.
Right, exactly. And again, you may or may not have the same amount of changes, but the interaction between the stakeholders and the team is enforced. Now, between 2001 and 2007, there were a lot of corporations that said, let's go ahead and take on Agile because it has so many benefits. The problem is they didn't realize that the investment in their employees, they had to give up employee time to make Agile work so well. And so oftentimes, you take on a fixed contract or you take on a traditional project and you say, oh, Guys, just do that work and we'll see it at the end. And if they knew the work well, that was great. But if they didn't know the work well, they end up with what we just talked about. Now, with Agile, you have to have that direct engagement, regular engagement. It's part of the principles of Agile.
Yeah.
And it's a necessary component. That's how change management happens. It happens right face to face, where people are having arguments and debate, and they're looking at prototypes and they're setting these things up, and they're having light bulbs go off and on all the time.
So let me ask you a different question. When you feel a change coming, or when one is presented to you, what's your first response?
Oh, man. Okay, first of all, my training kicks in. How do I create a change request around this? And then I say, okay, what's the impact to the project? I treat it as a risk.
Yeah.
Okay. And a change at that point is a future event. So I say, okay, first of all, what is this change and what's its potential? And I pull in information. If I don't know, I have my experts. And then I say, okay, let's consider the opposite. What if we don't change? What if something opposite of this happens? What if this is a good change? What happens if the bad side of that change occurs? And we have to go through that rigorous assessment. This is, and again, this is at my point in my career, this is pretty automatic.
Yeah. So if I was to go back to our previous discussion on Agile versus predictive, in Agile, you could just add it to your backlog once you've done your assessment. Potentially, you could add it to your backlog.
Right.
In predictive, you really have to look at your schedule, your resources. I've even had situations in a predictive one where if the change was large enough, I had to bring in an entire new team just to handle the change and manage that change along with the normal ongoings of the project. So it becomes almost a more complex approach to managing that particular change.
It's funny because I've often seen Agile and groups who are working with Agile more towards the natural human behavior, the way people behave around change. Like if there's a loud boom out on the street, 3 or 4 people go out on the curb and they say, did you hear that? Did you hear that? What do you think it was? What do you think it was? And that's basically Agile. That's the way we work, and do we know about this change? What do you know about this change? Can anybody tell us more? And basically that's how Agile works. And from change control, all of a sudden, it's not a ticket management system. It's not a formal set of processes. It's just the way people engage throughout the work. And it's hard to describe this to people, but that's basically what it is. It's integrated into the way people behave.
Yeah. So when I asked you what's your first response to an upcoming change, I have to confess my first response is a little more cynical. Especially if I'm on a long project and I know the constituents of that project, I know my clientele. My first response is often, who's the sponsor and what's the source? Because sometimes I can discount it based on, and that's a terrible thing to say, but human behavior. It's human.
It's funny. We have in stakeholder assessment, assessing authenticity.
Yeah.
But it's a nice way of saying, what's the source? Is it relevant? And again, it's very hard to assess this without engaging our personal opinions, because personal opinion is really bad. It says, if somebody gives me bad information, or if somebody tells me something that's not truth, I just flip the bid on them. I turn them from on to off.
Yeah.
And we can't do that. But there has to be some way that we capture information in such a manner that says, as we receive information from them, how can we give it the authentic weight it deserves?
Well, and I've been in situations where I actually questioned my analytical process, my own prowess in doing
Oh,
analysis. I remember very distinctly one particular project where a woman who was very, very good at her job, very, solid performer, smart person, but her ability to explain what it was that was needed, the requirements, was not very succinct or not very good. And she would often give us the requirements for what she needed, let's say for a set of reports. And we would put those down on paper. She would look at them, we'd discuss them, she'd sign off, we would implement. She'd come back during the test cycle and say, that's not what I asked for. And we'd go through the requirements. And she'd say, no, this is what I meant. So we would change them.
yeah.
And we would go back and make the change. And she'd come back and say, that's not what I asked for. And so pretty soon, because of her, we learned that she had a very distinct inability to present her requirements. At some point, we began to work with her staff to help us understand what was required. So
Yeah.
a lot of times you had to look at the sponsor or the source of the requested change.
Communication skills are tricky.
Yes.
Because number one, it may be an inability to communicate, but number two, the communication may be effective, but the critical thinking behind the analysis may be ineffective. And so I've had people, and this is one of the things that I look for when I work with people. I have them describe me something, right? And if they're not able to describe it in a succinct manner that clearly shows that they understand something, you don't just have indicators of experience, you also have indicators of confidence. There's work to be done, but you have to dig more. Like you said, you have to dig more to find out whether it's a communication issue or whether it's a critical thinking issue. And sometimes just working around that and building the protections of the project around that issue is often the only choice you have.
Yeah. So let me ask you another question. Have you ever been on a project where a change happened that impacted such that you had a hard time even addressing the change itself?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Emotionally as well as functionally. 9/11, I had 5 friends, 2 different projects out in on the island out there, New York, and I had a hard time wrapping my head around that. I had to turn into a robot for a few hours so I could go home at the end of the day. From a functional standpoint, too, when I was going remote with my marketing work, I had to think about, not just the emotional side, not just the psychological side, but the functional side. How am I going to interact with my boss? How am I going to interact with all my diverse teams? Am I going to have everything I do? And that's where the ad card kicks in. It's the establishment of the change, it's the establishment of the steps and the communication of the steps, it's demonstration of the steps and repeating the steps that actually finally help me stabilize and become functional. It took me a good 4 to 6 weeks to actually consciously make that change.
So that's interesting, because I wasn't really, when I asked you that question, I wasn't really thinking in terms of sort of external impacts on the project. But yeah, change can come from many sources, and those two that you just talked about, the 9/11 and the reverting to a totally remote model, those
Yeah.
are both impactful, and well, they can be very large as well. So
Yeah, and the problem is not only can it be psychologically or emotionally overwhelming, it can be intellectually
yeah.
overwhelming. And this is where my integration skills would kick in. And I had to go through this multiple times. And I remember this project is so much bigger than I thought it was going to be. oops. And how do I actually deal with that? How am I going to wrap my head around it so I can help groups of people wrap their heads around it?
The opening example that I used, where the legislation for the Affordable Care Act came right in the middle of our project. Had it come at the beginning of the project, it would have been much easier to redo our schedule, redo our planning for resource allocation, all of that. But because we were already past analysis into design and into some development, it impacted us much more because we were fully staffed. I think we had a couple hundred people on at the time. We had to be able to set some programming, some design aside in order to implement the latest legislative changes. We had to learn what those meant, both from a client perspective and from our perspective. Now, fortunately, along with that legislative change came legislative funding. So from that perspective, the change did not affect our client monetarily, but it did set us back time-wise.
Yeah.
Now, what can you do about that? You just have to kind of plan and go along with it in a way that says, we're not just going to throw this out, we're going to keep going, but let's figure out how impactful and what size this is. Do I need to bring on another team? Do I need to add people? Do I need to adjust my end user approach to this? Do I have to change mindset? And so it became very much, very much impactful and very much a large change that we had to deal with.
Yeah, it all of a sudden is no longer everybody in agreement. It's everybody has an opinion, but we have to have some direction, whether it's voting or multi-criteria decision analysis or something that says this is the direction the group has. And no matter what my opinion, we're going to support the group. And oftentimes I've had to drive the team towards consensus where, this is not opinion anymore. This is the way the group has decided, and we're going to support that. You can do that with your rank and authority, and nobody's going to feel good. You can say, okay, this is the way it is. Too bad. Or you can do it from a humanistic standpoint and use some leadership skills. But still, these major changes, we know they're necessary sometimes.
In this case, it was imposed upon us because legislation is legislation, right? So, but it was it was a fun time, actually. I mean, it was frustrating from the fact that we had to redo some work, but it was also a fun time because we were working with our federal sponsors in a way that helped them also decipher what some of the requirements were that they had basically legislated, but hadn't necessarily thought through the entire process. So it was an exciting time in many ways.
Yeah, and it gives you a sense of there's something big going on, and I'm part of something big going on.
Yeah.
And many of us felt like that as we were going through COVID and lockdown, and as we had these other huge national and sometimes even international influences and changes that said, whether or not this is a good or bad change, we're in this together.
Yeah.
And that's that wonderful sense that you get. And it is a unique opportunity if you're savvy enough to use that sense to say it's a we, it's not an us versus them. And only we will actually see this through.
And that's a very good admonition to anybody who's listening, because projects really are the bringing together of many different sponsors and stakeholders, and therefore we have to be able to work together to solve those issues. So you and I talked last time a little bit about do or die. So projects either have to change or projects can be eliminated. I mean, very much so. So what's some of your experience in terms of the need of a project to maybe sometimes just stop due to a change, or figuring out how to move forward? Any experiences, any enlightenment you can share with us?
Yeah, the first 2 or 3 times when I was considering closing a project early, I doubted myself. and I thought I had to be very careful in how I broached that, or I was going to get fired, because it was the sense that every project has to be successful. But as I worked with a series of mentors, I learned that just because a project closes early doesn't mean it's unsuccessful.
Yeah, I've only been involved in one project in my 40 years that closed early, and they closed incomplete, unfortunately. And it had gone through, I think, 2 or 3 project managers, and basically I was brought in to close it down and stop the hemorrhaging. So from the stopping of the hemorrhaging, it was successful, but from a black eye on our corporate reputation, it was not that successful because it didn't complete. So it's not a pleasant thing, but I think both us and our client learned from it in terms of how it is that you need to run these projects in a different way. So there was a learning experience. It was a costly one, but yeah, those are hard decisions.
Yes, they are. But you know what? If you can take learnings from them, at least you have that value for your future work.
Oh yeah, I definitely, even though I was brought in 2 or 3 years into the project, looking back over the history of the project, I vowed I wouldn't make certain mistakes that were obvious to me on my future projects. So that was the first and last time that I was actually on a project like that. So I did learn. Not that the company was paying for me to learn, the company was being paid handsomely to deliver, but what can you do in some situations like that?
Yes, indeed. So we're running out of time
We
here,
are,
Merv.
yeah.
So let's go ahead and end on our final question that we have every show. What can you tell emerging and fresh project managers in preparing or addressing managing business or environmental changes on your projects?
From my perspective, and I'm going back to when I was young and green, and the whole idea of organizational change management was not really out there. I think the first thing I would do is understand that change is more than just the project or the system or the program. Change really does affect the people around us. And so I think I would spend time as a fresh, young, green project manager learning and understanding what is meant by organizational change management and some of the influences that occur as a result of things that happen on projects or during system work.
Yeah, and it's not just the deliverable and its functionality and meeting schedules and budgets, but starting to understand, and maybe not even understand first, but capturing, the responses of people as they, get an idea and observe and finally participate in change, and start building your track record of being able to interpret first and then assist people through these major changes.
Yeah. And if I were to do it again, now that we see much more of how project management itself has matured, if I were to do this again, I would actually request of my senior management to be put on a project on the team that dealt with solely organizational change management. I've done a lot of the system work, but what about the organizational work? I would love to be part of a team like that and gain experience and watch what happens, because I think that would make me a better manager on the system side, understanding what's happening from the client side.
Yes, yes, I have done a lot of that executive consulting and advisement from an organizational change. It got me front row seat to a lot of these interesting transitional experiences.
And even if you don't go for your ProSci certification, at least read about it.
Yeah, and it's funny because these models, this model AdCar is right there in the PMBOK. You have your PMBOK, you can pull it out. It's right in the back there, right? It's under models. But at the same time, you can probably go out to the internet and it's all over. I remember when ProSci was starting to communicate this, and they came to the local chapter and they gave out these free books. And I was saying, this is a cool idea, because it had been like 4 years since I graduated my MBA, and we had in our organizational behavior a few weeks on organizational change management. I said, this is really cool. We're not just dealing with process change. We're talking about human change here. And that started my journey.
Well, I think we started off well, and I think we summarized it just as well. Of course, that's
Yeah.
a very self-serving opinion that I just provided, but
That-
I enjoyed myself today.
Oh yeah, from a satisfaction standpoint, as well as a checklist of all the things we wanted to talk about change management, I think we rang this true.
All right. We'll see you next week.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everyone.